Hello, I'm King Link, and this week we're doing a design review on Persona 4 Golden. Now, if you're new to the channel, this is a design review. Rather than just say the graphics, story, and gameplay are good, and assigning an arbitrary score to the game, I look deeper at the gameplay systems, try to analyze what works and could be improved on in the game, and usually using examples from other games. However, this week, Persona 4 Golden is such a massive game, so there's a lot to talk about with just it. I'm going to try to focus more on just Persona 4 this week. Now, Persona 4 is part of a long-running series called Persona that's part of a larger series, which is the Shin Megami Tensei series. I somehow have missed playing any of the series before, though I do remember playing Nocturne at one point. I barely remember it. So I'm coming to Persona 4 Golden with a very fresh look. Let's start looking at Persona 4 by talking about the battle system. This is a JRPG, so that's always going to be a major part of the gameplay system. In Persona 4, this revolves around a turn-based battle system set up with standard attacks and a 6-element system with enemies having strengths and weaknesses. Admittedly, I have just played Ni no Kuni 2 recently, so Persona 4's battle system feels a touch on the slow side, but with the ability to let the party members choose their attacks, and also using a rush system that issues very quick melee attack commands for every party member, the game does speed up a touch more, yet it still feels a little bit on the slow side. The gameplay here will look a bit like most turn-based battle systems you've seen in RPGs before, and admittedly it kind of is, for the most part. You choose attacks, there is good AI for your party members, but you can manually control them. Even the 6 elements here are a bit of standard fare. Fire, water, lightning, wind, and then light and dark, though both of the last two are just instant kill attacks for enemies. There is also a combo system here which rewards hitting enemies on the element that they're weakest on with additional attacks or essentially extra turns. It works well, but eventually the game starts giving you hard enemies that have no elemental weakness to avoid abuse of that system. I think that proves that that system is a bit overpowered. With every boss appearing to have no elemental weakness because of that system, it's a bit of a shame that it's tossed out when it's a critical fight. This isn't a typical RPG, though. While players will level up their character and gain new skills, the game is actually focused on what are known as personas. Personas in this case are just sub-characters that the main character will use to get access to their attacks and abilities. If you want a fire ability, you use a fire persona. If you want a wind ability, you can use another wind persona. That's at least how it works for the early game. Pretty quickly, though, you'll fill up on the number of personas that the player can carry, and the player will start having to combine and mix the personas in a special room. This is where Persona 4 starts to mix up its combat, in that it has hundreds of personas, and they can only be gained by mixing and matching personas with other personas, or sometimes drawing special tarot cards for those personas. It's in the Persona system that Persona 4 starts to shine, and God, I know, this is very confusing. I've said Persona so many times I think it's lost meaning. You can't, however, think of the Persona system as Pokemon, though in this case you have limited space, so you won't be able to catch and store them all. Instead, you have to register each persona you carry, and then you'll resummon them as desired after you use them in some other way, which you will want to do because that's the only way to get more powerful personas with better abilities. Only the main character can actually change his persona with this system though, as the rest of the party have set personas focusing on specific elements, but it allows the main character to have a lot more variety and the ability to have multiple different skill layouts for him. The collectible aspects though work well and gives the player something to chase throughout the entire game, as well as giving completionists a massive task to collect them all. With that said though, I found that I often would collect a full set of personas, but I'd only be focusing on 2 or maybe 3 of them at a time. Before long, I was actually able to start loading up personas with 5, maybe even 6 elements at the same time out of 8 total skill slots. They became so overpowered because they could hit any weakness on the board. There are a ton of other little features in the combat that help make Persona 4 into a compelling experience. After each battle, there's a choice of tarot cards where the player can get certain bonuses or negatives. They can get additional stats for their main character's personas or change the amount of XP or gold that the player will earn, or as mentioned, get a new persona from this system. The real goal, though, of the tarot system is trying to clear this entire board. If you're able to gather all the cards, the player starts to get bonus choices on the next drawing, which helps to cascade into clearing that board, and it's a way to get larger rewards and roll those rewards over to the next board and the next. While I don't think the tarot system is essential to winning the game itself, the reward system here feels unique and was quite interesting to use to maximize my rewards in the game. Now, one last thing, and one I wanted to point out as being essential for anyone who wants to design an RPG, is that the combat in Persona 4 is customizable. As the game starts, the game just asks you about the difficulty of Persona 4. After a couple dungeons, I actually checked out the actual difficulty screen, and sure enough, it's not just a preset difficulty. You have the preset options for difficulty, but you also can customize the game yourself. That means you can increase or decrease the damage you do to enemies or take from enemies. You can change the amount of experience or gold the player earns, even making it stingier or more generous. And you can even restart a level or a battle when you die. This is actually a great addition to the game, as players can choose what they want, whether it be easier battles, less danger from failure, or even fewer battles required, which is something I'm always asking for. I will, however, caution players, as I kind of messed with this in the 4th dungeon. I turned on just the enhanced money and enhanced experience, playing through the dungeon normally, and by the end of that dungeon, I had almost reached the levels players would be aiming for by the end of the game. I was only halfway through the game at this point. This isn't necessarily a major problem, but it does make it harder to go back to the normal difficulty when you've outleveled almost everything. In later dungeons, I was actually able to skip entire floors of battles, though this is kind of what I was hoping for, less grind. Yet, I do want to state that the difficulty options here have ruined me for other games. The choice to make a game more or less grindy is a good thing, especially in RPGs, and I would have loved to see a little more generalized system that didn't feel like it would break the game with the rewards, but this is still a great addition, and something I think every game can use a bit of. Combat is important in JRPGs, but I started the discussion there because admittedly, I think I spent the least amount of time with the combat system. I think it's the least important system here. Less than a third of Persona 4 Golden's runtime seems to focus on the dungeon. There is an ability to replay dungeons to get more rewards or hunt for quests that people give you. There's also the additional bosses, but for the most part, players will be focusing on other pursuits in the game. A big part of Persona 4 is the story. Now, a quick note, I'm going to try to focus my talk about the early parts of Persona 4 without venturing into the later parts of the game to avoid spoilers. I have far more to say, but I don't think it fundamentally changes my opinions on the game itself or how the story is delivered. I'm also going to try to leave major parts of the story for the player to discover. The quick version is there's a bit of a mystery story with people winding up dead early on, and the player working to save them in dungeons created by the Midnight Channel. A whole other mystery of what that is. I don't want to say more about it though, because it is spoilers, but I will say that the game did give a satisfactory explanation of the entire thing. Persona 4 though starts out with our main character arriving in Inoba, in a rather massive opening. Now this opening took me about 3 hours to even get to the point where I was making meaningful choices in the game. I've been calling our main character the main character because that's who he is. Once again, we have a JRPG where the main character says nothing and can be named anything. I'm just going to start here. I don't have a problem with the voiceless main character. With the name King Link, I think it's obvious I've grown used to that in The Legend of Zelda. Nor do I care if the main character isn't a major part of the story. I mean, that's common in almost every one of my favorite JRPGs. But Persona 4's main character rubs me the wrong way. First off, everyone calls him Senpai to refer to him, which is a good generic term. However, with the lack of personality the main character has, I start to wonder why he's not able to change genders. As I played through the game, I thought of multiple ways that this could actually be handled, and while some of the dialogue and situations are clearly intended for a male main character, the fact he's so strictly defined as male is strange because almost nothing else about him is defined. Is he studious, is he lecherous, is he more athletic or club-oriented? These are all questions that the players can make up for themselves. Now, some scenes will have to be reworked for a different gender, of course, but these are probably far and few between, and it's something that feels sorely missed because the main character feels like such a blank slate. Quick note here, after finishing the game and writing this, I did find out Persona 3 did allow different genders, so it's actually a step backwards here, not sure why. On the other hand, though, the blank slate also hurts the story a bit. Now, a voiceless main character can absolutely work in video games, if you're having limited dialogues with people, or if you're in a huge party where they're discussing stuff for you. But when there are so many scenes, including many dating scenes here, between the main character and a single other character, it's just awkward to have characters monologuing at the main player for so much of the game. The game does a great job in many situations here, but there are equally as many scenes that feel strange with limited responses that the players give. There's also clear moments that are set up for male players, such as the other male characters getting the main character to get his bike license so they can ride 2 people to a bike to feel the girls press their breasts to the backside of the guys. The thing is, I get that this is a game from Japan, which isn't surprising as a Japanese RPG that tends to be the country of origin, but it relies heavily on tropes that are from Japanese anime and manga about horny high school students. which I get the setup most of the time due to watching a lot of anime and reading a lot of manga back in college, but this will feel out of place for anyone not familiar with these tropes. The bigger problem with Persona 4 is that some of the game feels quite awkward. Part of the reason is the tropey nature of the game, and part of the reason is localization. Now, I understand some of the issues with localization, as I actually had to deal with part of it while working on Saints Row 2. Most games tend not to have variable length fields for text, and JRPGs almost never do. The window text that appears is a standard size, and the size, cadence, and layout of a joke will be important. There have also been RPGs that limit the number of text panels that will show between scenes. I don't know if that's actually an issue with Persona though. Translating between languages that have a huge difference between word size and style, most notably for us was German, which has compound words that are enormous, and Japanese and Arabic, both of which use extended characters rather than ASCII, causing other issues due to people not using localized string formats or localized strings at all, and so on. There's also non-breaking spaces, but that's a whole other thing as well. Really, localization is a hard process if not planned for. So translators have to be really careful about translation. A good amount of Persona 4 is extremely well translated and is clear. I think Yukiko's character arc, focusing on her staying as a manager of her traditional inn, is done exceptionally well. The problem is there's a decent amount of other parts of the game that feel strange or off, and a big part of this is the collision of Japanese culture and tropes, which Americans may not be familiar with, and then translating these larger constructs into smaller segments. Yukiko's translation works because her story is broken up over 10 segments, which allows the game to build on previous segments to explain her major decision. Trying to explain the complexity of scooter rules and having girls ride on the back of bikes needs to be done in a single discussion here, and it feels really out of place. And that's before we've talked about the changing social climate that we're currently in. There are just a few jokes that perhaps have aged poorly. Now, before people get angry, I think Persona 4 Golden did a great job at translating about maybe 80% of the game, especially with this being a second expanded attempt of the same story as Persona 4. But I can't deny that there are some issues here, especially with the entire game being a mystery. There are several characters I immediately fingered for being very suspicious, but ultimately it turned out it was more translation issues or trope issues that caused the awkward speech patterns. Even the fact that Nanako, the sister archetype, technically I guess cousin, is obsessed with Juness, a department store, and sings their theme songs made me feel that there was some otherworldly forces causing the addiction. And then almost suddenly the game stops talking about Juness. This probably was done to set up the Juness department store as a location, yet it's still a strange moment, and again, hardly the only one. The story is a major part of Persona 4 though, and you'll get a massive amount of it. Players will be seeing through 30 minutes to an hour of story segments multiple times over the course of the game, with a couple of the segments potentially taking upwards of 2 hours, usually for the major trips. Add in a few anime-style cutscenes and it's a pretty good time. I'd also love to talk about some of the characters, especially my favorite, Teddy, but again, I'm going to let you find out all about him and everyone else yourself. There's just one more section of the game that I've yet to discuss. Outside of the story and outside of the dungeons that don't last too long, you have what I'm going to be calling the dating simulator. Players will go to school 6 days a week, but after that they get 2 time segments, after school and evening. Players are allowed to decide what they want to do during this time. The major choice is going to be going to the dungeon to accomplish some goal, but this is actually rarely needed. The first dungeon is really hard and will require players to attempt the dungeon multiple times so that they can heal up. However, before long the player will run into a magic fox who will heal up your character for a small amount of money. Even with the normal cash flow, this quickly broke the game and allowed me to stay in the dungeon until I was powerful enough to beat the bosses, taking only about 2 or 3 hours per dungeon and a single time slot in the game. The idea of the dating simulator part of Persona 4 is that the player has a lot of other options during this time. Players can forge bonds with other characters, conduct activities, grow in power that will translate back into the combat system. That's at least the theory of the dating simulator, but in actuality it's just the core content of the game and feels like it has a lot of minor potential influences on the actual combat. Much of the story is actually told as part of the dating simulator, and the players will decide what they want to do each day. Persona 4 is played out over an entire year, and unlike This Is the Police, which did like 90 days out of a promised 180 days, players will actually be playing through almost an entire 365 days, with only a few days not allowing the player to make a choice on what they do. In the initial couple of months of the schedule, players will quickly feel a bit of fear of missing out or FOMO due to the number of options that are presented. In a single day after a couple months, players would be able to visit with party members, eat at a restaurant, go to a club activity or play sports, go fishing. Of course, they can also go into the combat arena as well, and these are only the options that the game offers at the beginning. Over time, the game keeps expanding on the list of activities, characters that you can interact with, and starts to offer jobs as well. Not every choice is available on every day, but that's also part of the FOMO of it all. Players will also have to balance their skills in 5 categories: knowledge, understanding, diligence, courage, and expression, along with the rest of the choices. Now, this system works very well in the opening months where everything feels new and you want to do it all. But by the end of the game, the process of choosing an activity becomes laborious. There's a little challenge in maxing all 5 skills, and even less challenge in maxing relationships with the characters you want to get to know. It's impossible to do everything in the game in a single playthrough, especially reading all the books or befriending every possible character. At least it's impossible without a guide. There are even other minor changes in the second campaign with an additional boss, so to see everything, players will require 2 playthroughs. But even with just 70 hours in a playthrough, which is probably on the low side, I find it hard to justify an entire second playthrough for an optional boss or chasing pieces of the game you missed out on. The biggest thing is there feels like a significant amount of fluff here out of a year of 365 days. There are at least 3 or 4 months that probably could have been skipped out here. Even just skipping all of summer and making it just 270 days of school probably could have worked. Maybe even cutting a couple of the months might be possible. Some changes to the dating formula might need to be made, but not much. And just to be clear, I'm not even saying they have to change any of the content here, but rather the way the game plays out. Now, if Persona 4 kept the feeling of FOMO, where the player can't do everything they want, and had to keep making hard choices on which activities they chose to do, I probably would have even considered a second playthrough. But after seeing a majority of the content in the first playthrough, there's not really a strong reason to replay the entire game. There's a bit of a bigger problem that nags at me with the length though, and it's not actually a problem with the game. I'm going to avoid a deep dive into this, but a lot of reviews seem to be of reviewers who barely played this game. There's a lot of focus on the first 10 hours in almost every review, and almost none mention how much of the game they actually played. Even if a reviewer did beat the game, they're under a significant time crunch to publish that review, so I have to imagine that they would skim part of the game instead of really savoring the entire 70, 80, 90 hours. Imagine a reviewer who's reviewing an entire TV show by watching a single episode, or watching the entire film at 1.5 time factor, and I think that's a similar comparison. I mean, it could be done, but we should be demanding reviewers are clear on how much they play. Now, this shouldn't mean a change for Persona 4. I don't think game lengths should be changed just to get reviewers to play the whole thing. Though, I think reviewers should be required to say how much time they put into the game, what type of path they actually took, main or how many side quests they really tried to do, or completion percentage, because it's noticeable how shallow some reviews are. Yet, games should be as long as they need to be. The thing is, I just think, personally, Persona probably could have shaved maybe 10 to 20 hours of decisions without losing any of the content in the game, maybe even creating a larger desire for a second playthrough from the player. Ultimately, though, I am going to recommend Persona 4 Golden to almost any fan. It's excellent to finally get this series on PC, and I want to see more of the Persona games on PC. Besides, for all the flaws that I brought up, I played this game for more than 80 hours, and I enjoyed almost every minute of it. Ultimately, I had a great time. Persona 4 isn't perfect. I would kind of argue that any game that's longer than 20 to 30 hours is going to have some level of flaws, but Persona 4 does the best it can to create a customizable and interesting experience. It has a story with characters that matter, a story about growing up, making important bonds with friends, and dealing with romance while fighting shadow monsters. Just like real life. That's what I have for Persona 4 Golden. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I certainly enjoyed this game, even if it took me almost like 3 weeks to play through the entire thing. If you've enjoyed this video, click that subscribe button and ring the bell to get notified of new videos first. Let me know what you think of Persona 4, and if I'm just being too hard on the game or if you agree with me. I'm going to pop up my recent video in Ni no Kuni 2. Honestly, I think I like that game just a slight bit more than Persona 4, but they're both great JRPGs. And if you want to look at my take on player choice, which Persona 4 has a ton of, you can check that video out as well. Until then, I'm King Link, and thank you for watching.